Venezuela, land of pristine beaches, lush rainforests, and, wait for it, oil. Lots and lots of oil. We're talking billions of barrels, enough to make it one of the world's largest oil producers. A potential paradise, right? Well, not quite. You see, oil wealth can be a blessing and a curse. It brought Venezuela riches, but also corruption, inequality, and instability. The economy became dependent on oil. When prices were high, life was good. But when prices dropped, ouch. This dependence on oil made Venezuela vulnerable. Corrupt officials lined their pockets while the poor struggled. Social unrest simmered. The stage was set for a charismatic leader promising change. Enter Hugo Chavez. Picture this, 1998. A year that would mark a turning point in Venezuelan history. Venezuela is reeling from economic hardship. The country is in turmoil, with inflation soaring and basic necessities becoming scarce. People are fed up with the old, corrupt political elite. They crave a hero, someone who can bring about real change and restore hope. Someone who speaks their language, understands their struggles, and can articulate their dreams and aspirations. Someone who promises a better future, filled with opportunities and prosperity for all. That's where Hugo Chavez stepped in. He emerged as a beacon of hope in a time of despair. A former military officer with a rebellious streak, Chavez had a knack for connecting with the masses. His charisma was undeniable. He spoke of social justice, of empowering the poor, of breaking free from the shackles of the past. His message resonated deeply with the people. He promised a Bolivarian revolution, invoking the legacy of Simon Bolivar, South America's liberator. People were captivated by his vision. They saw in Chavez a savior, a champion of the people, someone who could lead them to a brighter future. Little did they know, the road to revolution is paved with good intentions and often leads to unexpected destinations. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges and unforeseen consequences. Chavez wasted no time. He rode the wave of popular support and stormed into power. His Bolivarian revolution aimed to dismantle the old order and create a socialist paradise, redistributing wealth, nationalizing industries, empowering the poor. These were his goals. And you know what? Initially, it seemed to work. Oil money flowed, funding social programs, healthcare and education improved, poverty rates declined, people felt a sense of hope. Finally, someone was fighting for them. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. Chavez's policies, while well-intentioned, were built on shaky ground. They relied heavily on high oil prices. And as we know, what goes up must come down. Here's the thing about populism. It's great at making promises, not so much at keeping them. Chavez's reforms, while initially successful, created a system heavily reliant on government handouts. He nationalized key industries, but mismanagement and corruption led to decreased production. Price controls made goods artificially cheap, but led to shortages. The economy became increasingly reliant on oil, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Chavez, however, remained defiant. He doubled down on his socialist policies, blaming the West and imperialist forces for Venezuela's woes. But the cracks in the foundation were becoming impossible to ignore. The Bolivarian dream was starting to crumble. Section 5. From bad to worse. The descent into hyperinflation and scarcity. This is the story of how a nation once rich in resources and potential found itself spiraling into an economic nightmare. Remember that ticking time bomb we talked about? Yeah. It went off. The explosion was felt in every corner of the country, affecting every aspect of daily life. Oil prices plummeted, and Venezuela's economy went into a tailspin. The country, heavily reliant on oil exports, found itself unable to cope with the sudden loss of revenue. The bolivar, the national currency, became practically worthless. People watched in horror as their life savings evaporated overnight. Hyperinflation soared, wiping out savings and pushing millions into poverty. The cost of living skyrocketed, making it impossible for ordinary citizens to afford even the most basic necessities. Basic goods like food and medicine became scarce. Shelves in supermarkets and pharmacies were empty, leaving people desperate and hopeless. People were forced to queue for hours, sometimes days, just to get their hands on necessities. The sight of long lines became a common and heartbreaking reality. The situation grew increasingly dire. Frustration and despair were etched on the faces of Venezuelan citizens as they struggled to survive. Venezuela, once a beacon of prosperity, was sinking into an economic abyss. The contrast between the past and present was stark and painful to witness. But amidst the chaos, Chavez remained a messianic figure to his supporters. His charisma and promises of a better future kept hope alive for many. He had tapped into a deep well of resentment and skillfully shifted the blame for Venezuela's woes onto external enemies. The narrative of foreign interference became a powerful tool in his arsenal. His grip on power, fueled by fear and propaganda, seemed unshakable. The combination of military support and a loyal base of followers ensured his continued dominance in the political landscape. Section 6. Maduros Inheritance. A Legacy of Crisis and Authoritarianism. 2013. Hugo Chavez, the larger-than-life leader, dies, leaving behind a nation in mourning and a political vacuum. Enter Nicolas Maduro, his hand-picked successor, who steps into Chavez's shoes with promises to continue his legacy. A former bus driver and union leader, Maduro lacked Chavez's charisma and political acumen, but he was determined to follow in his mentor's footsteps. He inherited a country teetering on the brink of economic collapse, with empty supermarket shelves and a rapidly devaluing currency. Instead of changing course, Maduro doubled down on Chavez's policies, implementing measures that only deepened the crisis. He tightened his grip on power, cracking down on dissent and consolidating control over the judiciary and legislature, leaving little room for opposition. Opposition leaders were jailed, protests were met with brutal force, and the voices of dissent were systematically silenced. Venezuela was slipping into authoritarianism, with Maduro's government exerting increasing control over every aspect of life. The economy continued its downward spiral, with inflation rates soaring and the cost of living becoming unbearable for ordinary citizens. Hyperinflation spiraled out of control, reaching unimaginable levels, rendering the national currency virtually worthless. The once vibrant Venezuelan middle class was decimated, with many families struggling to make ends meet and facing poverty. People were fleeing the country in droves, seeking refuge in neighboring nations as the humanitarian crisis worsened. The situation was reaching a breaking point, with widespread protests and a nation on the brink of collapse. Section 7. Venezuela on the brink, a nation in freefall. Fast forward to today. Venezuela is now a shell of its former self. The economy is in ruins. Basic services like electricity and water are highly unreliable. Hospitals lack essential supplies. Malnutrition is rampant and widespread. The country is caught in a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. Maduro, clinging to power, blames everyone but himself for the crisis. The US, the opposition, even shadowy international forces are all accused of waging an economic war against Venezuela. But the reality is clear. His policies have utterly failed. The country is in freefall, with no end in sight. Section 8. Exodus. The Venezuelan migrant crisis and regional instability. Imagine fleeing your home, leaving behind everything you know and love. That's the reality for millions of Venezuelans. Faced with hunger, lack of opportunities, and political repression, they've embarked on perilous journeys to seek a better life elsewhere. This mass exodus has created a regional crisis. Neighboring countries, already grappling with their own problems, are struggling to cope with the influx of refugees. The situation has strained resources and fueled social tensions. The Venezuelan migrant crisis is a stark reminder of the human cost of this ongoing tragedy. It's a testament to the resilience of the Venezuelan people, but also a heartbreaking illustration of their despair. Section 9. The world reacts. International response and political deadlock. The world has watched the Venezuelan crisis unfold with a mix of concern and frustration. International organizations have issued condemnations, sanctions have been imposed, humanitarian aid has been offered. But the situation remains dire. Maduro's regime, despite its isolation, has clung to power, aided by allies like Russia and China. The opposition, though recognized by many countries as the legitimate government, has struggled to gain traction. The international community is divided on how to best address the crisis. Some advocate for dialogue and diplomacy. Others push for tougher sanctions and even military intervention. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan people continue to suffer. Section 10. A Glimmer of Hope. The uncertain future of Venezuela. The future of Venezuela hangs in the balance. The country is at a crossroads, facing an uncertain and perilous path ahead. But even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. The Venezuelan people, despite facing unimaginable hardship, have shown remarkable resilience and courage. They continue to fight for a better future, demanding democracy, freedom, and basic human rights. Whether Venezuela can emerge from this crisis and chart a new course remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, The Venezuelan people deserve a chance at a better tomorrow. A tomorrow free from hunger, fear, and oppression. A tomorrow where they can finally rebuild their lives and fulfill their potential.